Last year, I passed the TOPIK I exam. But because I have not seen many videos talking about taking the TOPIK I exam, actually most of the videos I've watched are about taking the TOPIK II exam, I figured in today's video I will break down why I took the TOPIK I exam, how I prepared for the exam, how I registered for the exam, and what my experience was like taking the exam at the Korean Education Center in LA. And then at the end of this video, I am going to reveal my results and sort of talk about my path forward in my Korean language learning journey. So let's start off with why I took the TOPIK I exam. So my main research focus is exploring representations of Black girlhood in children's literature. However, in 2023, and this was because of my growing interest in Korean culture, I had decided that I was going to add Korean children's literature as a comparative research focus. And essentially what that means is that I was going to start looking at representations of Black girlhood, specifically in Korean children's literature. There aren't that many Black studies scholars doing research in Korean children's literature, so I figured that with all of the intersections of my expertise, that I could add this new viewpoint and that it would be an interesting new path in the field of children's literature. And there are also a handful of grants that I want to apply to, and a majority of them do require some sort of validation that I am proficient and or close to proficient in Korean. So essentially in the long term, between my research and even applying to these grants, I was going to have to show that I had some sort of proficiency in the Korean language. And as a result, taking the TOPIK was going to be the most effective way that I could validate my proficiency. So in July of 2023, after I had just spent 6 weeks traveling throughout Korea, once I returned, I officially began my Korean language learning journey. Even though I had been on and off with self-studying the language since 2019. I had started off this official journey by applying to a grant from my college. It was a $500 grant, and as a result of that grant, I was able to hire a private tutor. I hired my tutor through italki. This is not sponsored, and I ended up working with Morning Sim. I had watched a bunch of her YouTube videos and I had decided that her teaching style aligned with my learning style, and so I ended up working with her from July 2023 until May 2025. So on average, we met between 2 to 3 times a month, and that was over the course of those 2 years, and that whole time equaled 35 hours over the course of 55 lessons. And so depending on my schedule, we ended up working together for 30 minutes, but most of my lessons were scheduled for 60 minutes. So during those 2 years, I also was doing my own self-study as well as spending time completing my homework. So I averaged about 2 additional hours of self-study during those 2 years. And so over the course of those 2 years, I ended up doing 173 hours of self-study. So when I add up the hours over the course of those 2 years, I ended up spending about 208 hours studying Korean, which ended up putting me at a high A2, low B1 level by the time I took the TOPIK I exam. So besides those general studying habits, I'm going to now tell you about how I specifically prepared to take the exam. So the exam is offered 3 times a year at the KECLA. It is offered in the spring, in the summer, and then again in the fall. So at the beginning of 2025, I had decided that I was going to take the summer exam, which ended up happening in July of 2025. So that ended up giving me about 6-ish months to prepare for the exam. So I immediately ran to YouTube and created a playlist of Korean language teachers on YouTube who were teaching questions and vocabulary from the previous mock exams and from the previous year's exams. I also created a playlist that had the top 500 nouns that are used in the exam, as well as the top 500 verbs on the exam. And then I also read through the topicguide.com exams just to see what kind of mock exams there were available. I would say that it probably wasn't until late February and or early March that I specifically started working with my Korean language teacher to prepare for the exam. And when we did start working together, we went through one of the mock exams on the topicguide.com, and we went through the exam question by question, and that took up 8 lessons, and each of those lessons were 8 hours. So then I spent a total of 8 hours over a couple of months going over one of the topic mock exams with my teacher. And then all of my additional study time was used to memorize the vocabulary, go over the verbs, as well as also completing other mock exams and watching those videos of Korean language teachers going over the exams. And then I spent all of June touring Korea, so I was like studying and not studying. But I kid you not, one of the conversations that ended up showing up on the topic exam was almost word for word a conversation that I had with a cafe owner in Busan. So you just never know that your time in Korea could also be helping you not only explore the culture and explore the language, but also be preparing to help you take the TOPIK exam. So in total, officially, I was only preparing for the exam for about 5-ish months. And then I had that 1 month spent in Korea. But despite those 6 months of preparation, I ended up making one crucial mistake. And I think if I hadn't made this mistake, I actually would have done better on the exam. And that mistake was never adhering to the time constraints when I was taking the mock exams. So the TOPIK is a timed exam, and while I understood that, I had never actually practiced that. And I truly believe that if I had built up those skill sets around the time constraints, I would have done better on the exam. And I'll talk a little bit more specifically about that when I talk about my experience taking the exam. But if I have one major piece of advice for you, do the mock exams with the time constraints. It is going to be the best way to build up that skill set. So now that I've told you about my preparation for the exam, let me now discuss the registration process. So I registered for the exam directly through the KECLA website, and I will link to their website in the description box below. So they have a section on their website dedicated to all things TOPIK, and you can even register to take classes there as well. So in the section, they have the exam dates, they have when registration opens, closes, the test times, the location, the registration fee, and the registration form. The form is in both English and Korean, so it is accessible in both languages. The one caveat is that you will need to write your name in both English and in Korean. So you should have a sense of how to spell your name using Hangul. I typed my information directly into the form and saved it as a PDF, but you could also download and print the form and fill it out by hand. The registration does require 2 passport photos. I took my passport photos at Staples, and for 2 photos, it cost me $19.38. You will need both photos because each photo is going to be attached to each page of your registration form. My passport photos were slightly larger than the size of the photo on the form, but don't worry too much about that. I just attached my passport photos to the form using a simple glue stick. So after printing out my registration form and attaching my 2 passport photos, I mailed off my packet to KECLA. I used a regular size manila folder so that I didn't end up folding any of my registration, but you can fold it and send it in a simple white envelope. KECLA does have information for how to drop off your registration form and payment, and you can also find that information on their website. So the registration for the July 2025 exam opened up on April 14th, and I ended up mailing my registration packet on May 2nd. I then received my registration form from KECLA on May 15th, and that was the second page of my registration form, and they sent it to me folded up in a white envelope. And that registration form, of course, had my passport photo attached to it. It also had my test number filled in, and it was also signed by one of the KECLA staff members. So that became my proof of registration. So make sure that when you receive that in the mail, you put it in a safe place where you can remember it, because that is the only way that you can get into the exam. So even though I had my registration ticket already, my check had not yet been cashed. It was actually cleared on June 26, which was 7 weeks from the time when I mailed my registration packet. So don't worry about your registration if your check hasn't cleared. I think it's just a delayed process of cashing the checks. Then on July 2nd, so now we are 2 months from when I mailed my registration form, I ended up receiving an email from KECLA confirming my test location, my test time, and the fact that I had a confirmation. In the email, I was also told what I was supposed to bring, which of course is my proof of registration, a clear water bottle, as well as correcting tape, and a valid ID. So make sure you have a clear water bottle if you do want to have water during your exam. If you live in LA, you don't have to worry about this next part, but I do want to talk very briefly about transportation and lodging if you are driving in and or flying in to take the TOPIK exam. So if you are traveling to LA for the exam, you should also be thinking about transportation and lodging while you are in the midst of your registration process. I was not traveling far. I was just traveling from San Diego, so I didn't have to worry about transportation. However, I did think about lodging, and I did end up making lodging accommodations. So I ended up arriving at KECLA at 8:45 in the morning because the exam started at 9:10 sharp. And I did this so that I would have a little bit of buffer time since it was my first time at the center. I parked in the parking lot, which was free to test takers. I also did see people go inside the building, so I just also followed them in. There was a security guard at the front door who was also letting us know where to go, and so he showed us to the elevator, and then we went to the second floor. Once we arrived at the second floor, there were staff members there as soon as the doors were open, and they ushered us into a small classroom. So in the small room, we had to show our ID, and we also had to show our registration form. And once that was validated, we were then taken into the main test room. So in the room, I would say there were probably about 30 tables, and each table was covered with a really nice black cloth. Each test taker had their own table, and you knew which table was yours because the first page of your registration form was attached to the table. So that's how we knew where to sit. My table was front and center, and I'm pretty sure that's because we were being organized in alphabetical order by last name. I was allowed to keep my book bag with me, but I did have to keep it tucked under the table. So the only thing allowed on the table, of course, is the correction tape as well as the clear water bottle. I brought my own correction tape, but you don't actually have to do that because they did have correction tape available if you did need it. Since I had gotten there a few minutes earlier, I decided that I would just go to the bathroom then, and then I roamed a little bit up and down the halls just to calm my nerves. And then once 9:10 hit, the doors were closed and no one else was allowed in or out. Technically, you can go to the restroom, but of course it does feed into your exam time, and you just don't want to lose any of those very, very precious minutes. So between 9:10 and 9:40, there are a lot of other bureaucratic things happening in the room, like them taking and putting away our cell phones. One thing to note is that you do need to turn off your cell phone before handing it to them, because if your phone goes off, you will be removed from the exam. So just turn it off, hand it over. They put it in with your registration in a little baggie for you, and then they will return it after the exam. There's also a staff member walking up and down the hall notifying us and or the other staff members that the exam has started. The center was closed to the public, so I do think that announcement was mostly for other staff members. So once that happened and we were officially ready to take the exam, they do hand out a special pen that you're going to need to take the exam with, as well as our exam booklets. Once we got our special pen and our exam packet, then another staff came around verifying that our exam numbers that are on our registration form is the same exam numbers that we wrote in on our exam packet or on the front page of our exam. All of the verifying and taking of the phones does take 30 minutes, so make sure that you are patient during that whole process. The other thing I will say is that while preparing for the exam, for some reason I thought we were going to have headsets during the exam, but actually at KECLA, all of the listening section of the exam is through speakers overhead, so there are no personal headsets used during their version of the exam. So once the exam officially starts, one of the staff members will open up the exam in front of all of us along with the CD for the listening section, since the listening section happens first before the reading section. Once the CD is then placed into the CD player, there is a moment of validation that everyone can hear what is being said. And I could hear it really well because, again, I was right in front of the CD player, but everyone else had the overhead speakers as well. So you could hear it relatively well throughout the room. But if you can't hear well, make sure that you notify them immediately. So once everyone confirmed that they could hear it, we were told to open our books and the exam began. The first part, the listening part, does last 40 minutes, and I would say that the listening part was actually the most comfortable part of the exam for me. Even though outside of taking the exam, I actually think my reading skills are stronger than my listening skills. After we completed the listening part of the exam, we then moved on to the reading part. Okay, so with the reading, I started off with a really great pacing. You should know that the exam starts off with the easier questions and then builds up to the harder questions. So for the reading, the sentences started off quite simply and then they moved into full paragraphs. So while I started off with really great pacing, by the time I had to be reading a lot more, I significantly slowed down, which then became a serious problem because I did not have enough time at the end of the exam to complete the reading section. During the last 5-minute call of the exam, I still had 4 questions remaining. So I did the best that I could do. I skimmed through the paragraphs of the reading and I just chose the answers that I understood the fastest. And then that was it. The test was over. The staff collected our exams and they also returned our cell phones. And then they gave us some promotional material about being able to study in Korea. We were also notified about when our test results were to be released, and that date was also pinned on a sheet of paper in the front of the room. So even though I did not feel super confident about my test performance, the moment that they called for the end of the exam, I 100% felt relieved. And I also felt really proud of myself for preparing as best as I could and for actually sitting for the exam. Thankfully, I did have a friend in the area, so as soon as I was done with the exam, I went to go hang out with her and we celebrated. So that is my second tip for you. Not only should you practice the mock exams with the time constraints, you should also have a way of celebrating yourself after taking the exam. Now, as for my results, I did receive 69 out of 100 on the listening portion, and it also shows that there is an average of 72.38, which means I am not too far below the average score or the average test taker. And then I scored 66 on the reading, and it looks like the average score is 66.96. So I am right at the average. So then my total score is 135 out of 200, which places me directly in the level 1 category. So in the Korean for the level 1, it says you can listen to personal conversation or discourse related to your daily life, grasp and infer content. And then for the reading, it says you can understand information and understand the meaning by reading phrases, sentences, and short text that you can familiarize yourself with in everyday life and in everyday public spaces. Which is great, especially since my goal this entire time was to be able to communicate with locals when I am traveling throughout Korea. I think over the next few years of my continued study, I definitely hope that both my language learning journey will allow me to have a stronger understanding of the language as well as a deeper skill set in reading Korean. So looking at the breakdown between level 1 and level 2, you can also see that I was just one question away from getting the level 2 on the TOPIK 1 exam. So with each of the more difficult questions, they are additional points. So I was just essentially one question off. Had I been able to read at least an additional question in the reading section, I definitely think that I would have made it to the level 2. Especially since it seems that the level 2 paragraph talks a little bit more about the stronger writing ability in short paragraphs, which I definitely have. However, the TOPIK 1 exam does not test for writing, it only tests for listening and reading. These scores do last for 2 years, so my scores will expire in August of 2027. And for now, I don't plan on retaking the TOPIK 1 exam anytime soon. The next time I plan on taking it will be when I feel that my Korean language skill set is strong enough to sit for the TOPIK 2 exam. And the TOPIK 2 exam is for intermediate and high-level learners. So until then, I am going to keep up with my self-studying. I do plan on returning to Korea in the summer of 2027. And then from there, I'm going to decide whether I should sign up for an online and or in-person course, or if I should continue to take courses asynchronously. Either way, I'm glad that I took the TOPIK exam because I do think that it is helping with my confidence and it is showing me that I have learned a lot. So I would also encourage you to take the TOPIK 1 exam if you feel like that this would be a good time for you to see your progress in learning the language. And if you have any questions about taking the TOPIK 1 exam or about my Korean language journey, feel free to leave them in the comments below. And so, as always, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.